let's take a look at the secret Soros fascist fund, because it turns out that old George Soros, the third worldist, progressive, liberal, leftist,
ancient,
ancient, surprisingly still
eldritch
alive man.
demon.
His family is funding evil fascist magazines, or at least Vanity Fair would like you to believe that that's the case. And we'll be looking at what's been going on with that. First, though, if you want to give us, the real fascists, some funds. We're not actually fascists. We're not.
I was going to say.
Don't worry, we're not actually fascists. Then you can fund us by buying the merchandise that's available on the website. Right now, we've got the featured products. We've got the Donald Trump fight mug. We've got Trump. That was the original plan for it. Rump 24. No, it's Trump 24. The man just wanted to grill. And some wonderful t-shirts like the Metal Islander magazine t-shirt. So get a hold of that while you still can. Every bit of merchandise that's on the website is pretty much limited for a limited, only available for a limited time. So get it while you still can. Anyway,
I'm gutted that my much idea of it ain't gay if it's the CIA didn't get in there, but never mind.
There's always next time.
I know.
There is always next time. So this article came out just the other day. Why is a progressive mega donor funding right-wing ideas? This is an article from yesterday. It's on Vanity Fair. It's by Andrew Fedorov, who talks about how at a recent get-together, little lefty mags were roiled to learn that George Soros' foundations are supporting Compact, a publication that has flirted with authoritarianism. It was weird to me the whole effing time, says one attendee. So that's the little byline they've got there to draw you in.
Soros, not authoritarian at all, not in his politics.
Well, he leads the Open Society Foundation. The Open Society, of course, named after the Open Society and its enemies by Karl Popper.
Which is a very subversive name for his Open Society, because in many ways he's doing the antithetical thing to what that book argues for.
Even then, the Open Society itself is authoritarian in its own way, because it's essentially the perpetual liberal democracy, which can only exist if liberal democracy is policed at its fringes and ideas outside of those fringes are ruthlessly repressed, which might have something to do with why George Soros, or his son Alexander in this case, is funding a magazine like Compact, which the mainstream media would like you to believe is some kind of radical far-right publication. I think you'll see through the course of this, it is certainly not. Certainly not if you look at the activities of its founder and editor, Sohrab Al-Amari, who is a man that we've spoke about on the podcast before. Specifically with Connor, I've spoken about him, and Connor has said, quite rightfully so, not to be trusted. Anyway, so the context for this that goes into it on the article is that in June in London, the Open Society Foundations convened a meeting of small publications from around the world. Editors travelled from South Africa, Nigeria, Mexico, Argentina, the United States, and elsewhere. In the preceding year, the foundations, now under the chairmanship of George Soros' son Alexander, had unleashed what felt like a flood of funding in the small-budget world of little magazines. Among the American lefty magazine luminaries drawn across the pond were the New York Review of Books editor Emily Greenhouse, Dissent co-editor Natasha Lewis, N+1 co-editor and publisher Mark Krotov, the Baffler editor-in-chief Matthew Shen Goodman, Jewish Currents editor-in-chief Ariel Angel, and Lux editor-in-chief Sarah Leonard. Many, but not all of the present publications, including the New York Review of Books and all of the other ones, had at one time received funds from the OSF, which makes sense because they're attending a big conference, or at least a meeting held by the OSF. But remember in that as well that the Soros Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, George Soros himself, has no influence in politics whatsoever.
That is a conspiracy theory, of course.
No, he doesn't control any of the media or fund anybody except for all of these massive magazines. It appears the article itself won't let me scroll down anymore, but I have the rest of the information in my document here.
People say the same thing about Bill Gates, just like, why are all these conspiracy theorists talking about Bill Gates? The fact that he donates to the LA Times and then all of a sudden their unfavourable coverage becomes favourable has nothing to do with the fact he financially supports them.
No, of course. Control over media magazines, control over the funding of them is, of course, a way to influence discussion that goes on and a way to control discussion that goes on. It carries on. Standing apart from the other Americans was Sohrab Ahmari, an editor of the online magazine Compact and the former op editor of the New York Post. The political drift of his magazine, which the New York Times' Michelle Goldberg described as mostly a reactionary publication with a strong authoritarian streak, clashed with the other attendees. Ahmari founded Compact in 2022 with Matthew Schmitz, a fellow conservative editor, and Edwin Aponte, don't know how to pronounce that, a Marxist who left the project due to irreconcilable political differences. His mission at the outset was to promote a strong social democratic state that defends community, local and national, familial and religious against a libertine left and a libertarian right. So immediately putting themselves against you, Josh.
Not me. I'm not very well today. You can't be mean to me.
It doesn't matter, of course, that he left. The very fact that it was started with a Marxist should tell you quite a lot. Despite the bipartisan framing, according to the Vanity Fair, their most prominent startup funders belonged to the right. According to Aponte, they included Peter Thiel, the right-wing tech investor and J.D. Vance mentor, and chairman of the board of the Claremont Institute, Thomas Klingenstein, both of whom, in Aponte's view, should be robbed of all their money by a mob of poor people. What a delightful chap, eh? That's pretty authoritarian, let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, carrying on, while Ahmari has not criticised the Open Society itself, why would he? They paid him. He has expressed distaste for the West's Open Society ethos writ large, writing in a 2022 article that it's characterized by censure and censorship. His words also hyperlinked to a post by Richard Hanania, who some have labelled as a white supremacist, but others, more correct like myself, have labelled the worst person in the world.
I don't get him. Why is he... What is his whole shtick?
He seems very astroturfed, to me. Because it says here, he has acknowledged that he previously wrote racist posts, but said he no longer supports extremist ideas. He wrote for VDare, and I think he wrote for the UNS Review back in the day under a pseudonym. But of course, that drew him notoriety, that drew people in from the more radical fringes, but then when he reveals himself, he then disavows those and immediately begins to basically promote a version of human biodiversity and race realism, if you want to call it that supports the idea that liberals are inherently smarter, they have higher IQs, they're more open to experiences, they're basically better than low-class, stupid Republican voters.
So it's basically the regime's ideology, more or less.
Yes.
But isn't he a Palestinian himself?
Yes, but he is fervently pro-Israel. He basically says that Israel isn't genociding the Palestinians, but they need to. That's his position on it.
It's a controversial position.
So he is a creature of the regime. He represents, along with a lot of the people who will be spoken about here, the rightmost part of the regime discourse, where they want you to allow. So here's the Overton window. Here's where the mainstream want it to be. Here's the rightermost edges. Here's all the stuff that's actually dangerous to the regime and the mainstream and the status quo.
Does this function as in it tries to suck people in from the fringes into acceptable discourse, sort of within the train tracks of neoliberalism?
Yes, and this is in all likelihood why somebody like George Soros and his son would want to fund a magazine like Compact, because it keeps everybody nice and centred, nice and centrist in their views. And it says here, nevertheless, the year after that Compact article, OSF awarded it $200,000. So again, this seems like a collection of some of the worst people in the world, all policing the edges of acceptable discourse to make sure that you don't start to think about anything like ethnic solidarity or the need for mass deportations of foreigners in your country who come in and explicitly make it a worse place. They want you to be aware that there is such a thing as biological diversity between humans, but only between classes, which means that the Democrats who are higher class are better than you who have your backwards repressive ideas.
It's basically saying that the bureaucrats policing your life and making it a living hell is superior to you, and therefore just obey them.
Yeah, I think Hanania describes himself as somewhat of a Nietzschean. So he basically presents the idea that the Democrat status quo is the Nietzschean Superman master morality. Whereas you, with your petty nationalisms, that's slave morality.
But that's a really, really tough sell when you look at who the Democrats are.
And when you look at any picture of Richard Hanania himself and consider this man thinks that he is biologically superior Superman material.
Yes, I don't see him as being an ubermensch personally.
No, but I've considered this basically what it is. It's a cuckoo's nest. You get sold that you're getting right-wing, authoritarian, radical views in something like Compact Mag, but then the egg hatches and that you're just getting centrist social democracy all over again, every single time. That's what it exists to promote, as we'll find out. Carrying on, presiding over the meeting in London was Leonard Bernardo, OSF's senior vice president, known to most as Lenny. As the head of OSF's Idea Workshop, which started about 20 months ago, he is the face of this flood of funding to small publications. He clarified, "Our interest is in ensuring that magazines of different stripes but not large publications have the ability to offer elements of critique in the world of ideas and imagination. And that world apparently includes Compact, which Bernardo believes is gathering a new mix of ideas and bringing forward an important set of critiques. There's a real progressive commitment to a strong state and a state that itself is undergirded by commitments towards fair distribution of wealth." So basically what he's saying there is, well, yeah, they have some socially conservative values, but really what they're promoting is a strong state that will always benefit the bureaucracy, which benefits the Soros foundations and other incredibly liberal foundations, because they get to fill the strong state full of their own agents.
But also, what gets called conservative in this day and age, and what sometimes gets regarded as conservative, or even sometimes called far right, would have been acceptable for, a 90s Democrat platform.
Yeah,
as we see with lots of Republicans, actually.
Bill Clinton's family values is the furthest right the social conservatism goes, except with gay marriage. That's what they want you to think is the most right-wing kind of discussion that you can have, and they want you to police it yourselves. Indeed, it carries on, the magazine has published writers whose intellectual origins lie on the left and right, from Slavoj Žižek,
famous for being an apologist for
Stalin.
Marxism, and I think sometimes the Stalin stuff can be a bit on the nose to wind people up. Like, there was a Vice documentary where they went round his house, and the first thing you see is a little portrait of Stalin when you walk in, and he just says, "I just put this here to wind people up."
Oh, that's. So, I'm going to say Slavoj is a very entertaining man,
as long as you don't have to listen to him.
But
it makes me want to blow my nose out.
That's when he's most entertaining.
It makes me want to clear my throat and blow my nose out of solidarity. I just, how empathy can drive you to do strange things.
Are you hoping that there'll be some kind of psychic communication where he gets the urge to blow his nose as well? Yeah. Come on, Slavoj, you can do it. You can do it. But it's also published articles from Curtis Yarvin, who it describes as a race theorist, advocate of benevolent dictatorship and new right blogger. That's probably the most accurate description of someone in this article so far. Bernardo's contact with the right has extended beyond Compact's founders. For example, he's personally rubbed shoulders with Yarvin. "I haven't solicited or received any funding from OSF," said Yarvin over email, but noted he introduced me to an OSF board member, Ivan Krastev, who I liked a lot. Now, I just want to point something out, which is that these people may all have great diverging ideological views and some of the minor details, but there is something that's connecting all of these people. Soros, Greenhouse, Bernardo, Schmitz, Curtis, Leonard. There's something connecting all of them, but I can't quite put my finger on it.
Me neither.
No, I can't figure it out, so maybe somebody else can put that into words for me. Compact, it carries on, unlike other projects, Bernardo argues, is worthy of support because it offers challenging ideas while meeting his expectations of rigour. I'm uninterested in what I will call ideas that are beyond the pale, ideas that simply are, for example, of a generally racist or denialist character, but ideas that I disagree with, ideas that I find fault with, ideas that trouble me. If they have particular standards of reasonability and decency, I would want to ensure that there is a proper hearing so that we can, in the broader marketplace of ideas, contend with them accordingly. And that's everything you need to know from it. There are ideas that are still outside of the respectable boundaries of decency, which we don't want anybody to be promoting, but there are ideas that are slightly on the fringes that we want people to think are as far as you can go. We want to draw a border around these ideas and say you can go no further. We don't want current orthodoxy challenged.
I can see this being quite effective because
it's containment.
If you can't, it's sort of like imagining, well, what is at the edge of the universe? If you have no contact with it, it's impossible to know, and you can't just magically imagine it. You have to come into contact with it. And if people are policing the fringes, it's a very good way of making people completely unaware that there are different paradigms that challenge the existing one.
But the paradigms that they're trying to keep you within here do not challenge the status quo. Not really. They want you to think that as far as you can go is social democracy, but with family values. Mm-hmm. Which might work for some if that's your...
It's basically a reinvention of liberalism, isn't it?
Yeah, if that's your preference, then that's absolutely fine. But presenting it as far-right authoritarianism is false advertising done very much on purpose, deliberately, to mislead you.
Well, people tend not to have a very good idea of how the political landscape actually lies outside of what the current political paradigm is, what's within the Overton window. Like, it takes a lot of deliberate work to understand which ideas lay outside of that window and where to characterise them, I suppose.
I think there's an easier way of figuring out which ideas you're not allowed to talk about, which is if you talk about them, will groups like the ADL go after you? Will groups like the SPLC go after you? Will Hope Not Hate do a hit piece on you? That's where you can understand.
Will you be arrested?
Or will even people... supposedly on the right, will James Lindsay, will Konstantin Kisin, will Richard Hanania go after you?
So talking about the Archangel Michael is now beyond the pale.
Basically, I mean, to be fair with James Lindsay, I think his brain broke at some point. I think he's actually insane, and I think he needs help. But
I almost feel a little bit bad talking him down, because obviously a lot of the online abuse he gets has been getting to him. And I feel a little bit sorry for the guy.
Well, I've thrown some of my own, so I'm not going to take it.
It's okay.
But carrying on. So what does the compact do? Well, giving credit, they are pro-Trump. And that's about the only thing that I'm going to say in their favour. They talk about immigration as a constitutional issue. I think some of the better indicators of the kinds of things that they talk about and the way that they act as containment is Chris Rufo, who does do good work. I will give him credit for doing some good work, writing an article saying against racialism, left and right. So this, again, is against the idea that there are group differences and that these groups, and because of their differences, will not always mesh together properly. They will, in fact, violently clash. No, we don't have that.
The definition of containment, though, because the genie's out the bottle now, right? You can't put that away.
With mass migration, especially into Europe, and even mass migration of, say, the Haitians into Springfield that's happened very recently, people have got more contact than ever before. They're noticing the differences. And they're saying, we can't live like this. We can't live together.
Even within
too different.
Even within the paradigm of the anti-woke liberals, you know, you can still push back on this stuff because, of course, you've got that argument that gets bandied around whereby they say, well, if there's such a thing as multiculturalism, then there has to be cultural differences. You hear that from those sort of tepid anti-woke people, don't you?
Yes, and Soros Amari seems to me to be very much of the tepid anti-woke. But let's see what else they've got here.
Marco Rubio, that's interesting.
Very much anti-regime is Marco Rubio? No, not at all. One of my favourite ones down here was, why Ta-Nehisi Coates hates Israel? I mean, for me, my personal gripe against Nehisi Coates is the fact that he is massively anti-white and a spewer of anti-white hate propaganda. But no, apparently it's Israel that we should be most focused on in this. That's very, very interesting. And Soros Amari, he writes articles for them, of course, because he is a founder and an editor for them. Most of it seems to be regarding the election, which you would expect. Here's one from January, though, that I thought was very interesting. The right's foolish drive to cancel MLK.
Oh, you're the right man for this one, aren't you?
I am, because if you go onto the website, if you're a premium member, you can find my podcast from last January, 2023, explaining to you why MLK is not a conservative hero. Now, what it appears to me is that Amari would want you to remain within the civil rights paradigm. that we should judge people by the content of their character and not their colour. But the thing is, the right's foolish drive to cancel MLK is entirely based on examining him by his character.
Yeah, well, he wasn't a good man. He wasn't a moral man, and in fact, many ways, he's a very, very immoral figure.
For one, he participated in a rape.
That'll do it. Yeah.
That is the first and foremost thing I think anybody should say about his character. 2, he was a massive plagiarist. 3, if you look at the FBI reports from people who were examining him at the time, you'll see very, very clearly he was not an intelligent man. He was not an articulate man. All of his most famous speeches were written by his handlers, who were people like Stanley Levison. He was in favor of reparations. His handlers themselves, Stanley Levison, communist. Mm-hmm. And by the time that he was assassinated, he was pushing for more and more and more radical redistribution of wealth.
Wasn't he a Marxist as well?
Basically. Mm-hmm. He said in some of his books that he wasn't, but if you examine some of the more personal interactions that he had with people, he said that he was a socialist and just couldn't call himself a Marxist because of his because of Marx's materialism, whereas he was a Christian, so he couldn't go with a full materialist view of the world. That seems to be the only difference. Yeah. That's why he has a speech that centrists like to point to saying, why I am not a communist. It's all to do with religious disagreements in terms of the way that he would want the state to be structured and in terms of the way that he would want wealth to be redistributed. He absolutely was. The centrist and centre-right attempt to hold him up as some kind of conservative hero is a lie, frankly. It's a complete lie that's meant to keep you within that civil rights paradigm, because the Civil Rights Act was the first great piece of anti-white legislation that was passed in America. Hate to break it to you, Sohrab Ahmari, not to be trusted because of this. Here's some of his past clangers as well.
So just to be 100% on that, because why would you say it's anti-white? I know why you are, but just for the sake of the audience.
Because of the fact that it was just used along with a number of court orders and judges' decisions in the 1970s to allow for basically racial hiring. Racial preferences on hiring, where there were a number of cases throughout the 1970s that basically meant that employers had to discriminate against white people in preference of ethnic minorities. Mm-hmm. This came about at the same time. Civil Rights Act 1964, 1965, you have the Hart-Celler Act, which opened up America to mass immigration from the Third World, as opposed to the 1924 to 1964 Immigration Act, which basically restricted it to European immigration, and even then very restricted.
Mm-hmm. But your video is great on that, so I do suggest people go and watch that.
There's a lot to it, but it is pretty simple that basically civil rights makes it so that racial hiring preferences are now legal, but only in favour of ethnic minorities. The year after, mass immigration from ethnic minorities comes about, and then you start to see the development of woke, which I see mainly as an ideology purpose-built to disadvantage whites.
So he's writing this article basically to make people alleviate the symptoms of the problem, but not the actual root cause of it.
Yeah, it's to keep people from exploring the option, saying, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe this was a mistake, a group-based mistake in group resource conflict meant to disadvantage me as a member of my group. Yes. That's the kind of thinking they don't want you to have, which is why he's able to write articles like this. The new racist right are uniquely dangerous, and call anybody who's racist Nazis, as of course we know is what the right wing do. That's a right-wing talking point, that you're a Nazi if you disagree with me, right?
No. In fact, even some of the left are getting fed up with this.
Yeah, it's because it's pathetic. It's pointless. And he just, says that, the real threat is the white nationalist potential uprising.
Is it?
Yeah, which is the classic centrist line. He also wrote this a few months ago, which was one of my favourites. Biden's performance should make us grateful for the deep state. I examined this one at the time. That was fun. He had an opinion piece from Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times called "The Right-Winger Calling for Social Democracy," which was an interview and a review of his book Tyranny Incorporated, which outright states here, much of the book's analysis feels decidedly leftist.
That's because it is.
Yes. I kept wondering how Amari had gone from conservative cultural crusader to genuine economic populist, and more important, whether any other social traditionalists could make the same leap. And there it is. He is supposed to provide a blueprint for how to switch you from being a radical far-right danger to the mainstream into being a milquetoast centrist who, he's got a few conservative views here and there, but otherwise completely upholds the status quo.
So do people who are entirely apolitical. It's like you could just get a lobotomy of your political views and ask someone on the street, what is the best way to raise a child? Oh, with 2 parents. Oh, what are you, far right?
Well, again, that's as far right as you're allowed to go in this paradigm. Here's one that came out today called T. Biden's Economic Reformers Deserve Another 4 years, no matter who wins.
I want to break something reading this title.
American viewers, right now, please let us know in the comments, how well are these economic reforms from Joe Biden's team going? Are you better or worse off than you were under Trump?
There are so many metrics. This is just gaslighting. I take this as a deliberate personal affront to anyone with functioning eyes and ears.
Anybody who goes out and notices that when they shop at Walmart, their bills are significantly more expensive.
What's the price of gas these days? When Trump was president, wasn't America energy independent? What happened to that?
Well, apparently, it was a dogged group within the administration building support for a manufacturing revival in the US. That thing that Donald Trump was working on.
Yeah, that was why his Rust Belt, support was really high. He was doing that.
Well, apparently, no, Donald Trump's economic reforms, his approach to the economy, no, that wasn't good enough. We need to stick with the Biden approach. Bidenomics, 2 thumbs up, says radical right Sohrab Ahmari, an authoritarian, but not the kind that the Vanity Fair would like you to think. And here's the funniest one. So we covered at the time that there was the interview that Tucker Carlson did last month with Darryl Cooper, Martha Maid, which made all of the usual suspects absolutely freak out. Well, guess what? Sohrab was one of them, calling him a Nazi apologist, calling him a barbarian right pseudo-scholar. Although I do quite like the name barbarian right. That's quite good.
You do fit the bill quite well.
Thank you very much for that one. I'll take that. Thank you, Sohrab.
Yeah, he took a nuanced view. He tried to approach it as a historian and look at both sides of arguments, lots of different sources. That was his approach to it, rather than being an ideological and saying, obviously he's a bad guy and that's all you're allowed to say about it.
Well, I mean, he acknowledged that Hitler was a bad person and that what he did in the East especially was terrible, but he also said, hey, we also did a lot of bad things, and Churchill was, and you can even look at contemporary accounts from his contemporaries that agree with this, a warmonger who wanted to escalate the war, which he did. Now, if you're in support of that, I disagree with you, but fair enough. But it's not pseudo-scholarship to say such a thing.
Well, it's certainly within the bounds of acceptable public debate in a reasonable society, isn't it?
Well, we're not in a reasonable society, and Sohrab, as with everything to do with Compact, wants to police those boundaries. If you can't criticize the way that the Second World War is portrayed in mainstream histories, then you can't criticize the way that the narrative is used today to justify constant American adventurism and interfering in international wars. Because that's the way that it's used.
The way in which people discuss World War II tries to justify future adventurism, doesn't it? That's part of the reason for it. And my position is that war is hell and we should avoid it as much as possible, except in extreme circumstances where you actually are forced into it.
Yes, but that's why George Soros is funding Sohrab Ahmari and Compact. It is to keep you in the playpen of acceptable discussion and not go thinking any dangerous thoughts now. So it's not really fascist. Maybe it is, but not in the way that Vanity Fair thinks it is.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you can always follow Bo's series Epochs. This time he's talking about Caesar entering Gaul. And if you want to see all the other things that we're talking about, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.